Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Britt never anticipated that the torment of her captivity would have nothing to do with the names that had haunted her for years. Faison and Peter, the specters who had shaped so much of her past, were not the ones pulling the strings this time. The truth that lay behind her confinement was far more insidious, far more personal than she could ever have imagined. Whispers spread like wildfire across Port Charles, each rumor darker than the last, but it was in Dubrovnik, where she had once been spotted under such strange and secretive circumstances, that the truth first began to unravel. The quiet dread in her eyes, the careful movements, the tension in her voice, these were not the signs of freedom, but of a woman living under unseen chains. Her own family, with its legacy of blood, betrayal, and cruelty, was at the root of the nightmare now consuming her life. When Jason tracked her down, determined to bring her home, he expected resistance born of pride or fear of danger. Instead, Britt pushed him away with an urgency that cut deeper than defiance. There was something behind her refusal, something far heavier than fear of the outside world. The dismissal was not meant to save herself but to protect Jason from stumbling too close to the truth. She was surrounded, not by enemies in the shadows, but by kin whose obsession with control and dominance had taken new, twisted forms. The great irony was that those she should have been able to trust were the very ones binding her spirit. There were no more monsters in masks, no more shadows of Faison or Peter. Instead, there was the suffocating weight of inheritance, an endless cycle of power, manipulation, and cruelty repeating itself through her bloodline. Jason sensed it even as he turned to leave. His instincts screamed that something was wrong, and in that fleeting moment of hesitation, he stumbled upon the thread that would unravel everything. A misplaced folder, a half-burned photograph, a whisper through the walls, each fragment came together to form a picture more horrifying than anything he could have imagined. What he uncovered was not merely a hidden scheme or a cruel imprisonment. It was the resurrection of a name long buried under grief and memory. A secret thought dead and gone was stirring once again, and its name was Nathan. The revelation struck like a thunderclap. Nathan, the man everyone believed had died in 2018, had not only survived but chosen a darker path. Once, he had been the bright light, the one member of the family who seemed untouched by the shadows of their legacy. His death had been mourned as a tragedy, a cruel end at the hands of Faison that tore through Maxie, through Britt, and through everyone who had loved him. But now, there were signs. Irrefutable signs, that Nathan had never been buried by that gunfire. He had survived, disappeared, and in the silence of those lost years, something within him had twisted into something unrecognizable. Jason's discovery was chilling. There were reports tucked away that documented movements tied to Nathan's alias, bank records that hinted at a carefully orchestrated life outside the light, and, most damning of all, photographs. Faces captured through the grain of surveillance lenses, Nathan's profile blurred in motion, yet unmistakable. He had chosen not to return, not to reach out, but to transform. The Nathan of yesterday had died in truth, but the man that walked in his shadow was alive, alive and dangerous. No longer the man who fought against the family curse, Nathan had become an embodiment of it. What horrified Jason most was the realization of Britt's role in this sick evolution. She wasn't simply being held. She was being molded, manipulated, controlled in ways that blurred the line between medicine and cruelty. Her Huntington's disease, the one condition that left her physically vulnerable and emotionally raw, had become the very tool of her captivity. The medications she needed were withheld, altered, or administered only under conditions of obedience. It was a leash disguised as treatment, a cage made invisible by the facade of care. Nathan had not only stepped into the legacy of Faison and Peter but had refined it, perfected it, turning control into an art of subtlety and submission. The tragedy of it all was not lost on Jason. For years, Nathan had been remembered as the hope, the proof that not all of Faison's descendants were doomed to darkness. He had been the antithesis to Peter's cruelty, a brother who inspired love rather than fear. To learn now that Nathan had faked his death and embraced the very path he once stood against was to witness the final collapse of that hope. It was betrayal made flesh, a wound so deep it threatened to destroy Britt from the inside out. Jason now stood at the crossroads of a nightmare. His mission was no longer just to rescue Britt but to confront a man who should have been untouchable. To fight Nathan meant striking at the heart of Britt's last fragile connection to family, the one person she might still have chosen to protect even against all reason. If Jason fought to free her, he might very well become the executioner of her brother's memory. But if he hesitated, if he allowed the bonds of blood to slow his hand, Britt could be lost forever within the walls of a prison Nathan had built around her with his newfound mastery of cruelty. Nathan's survival was not just a revelation, it was a curse returned to life. He had shifted from victim to villain, from lost son to captor, from protector to tormentor. His existence redefined the rules of the game. This was no longer about Faison's shadow or Peter's ambition. This was about a bloodline that could never be outrun, a cycle of dominance and destruction that now lived on in the very man who had once promised to break it. For Jason, the path ahead was darker than he had anticipated. Every step toward freeing Britt meant wading deeper into a family war where love, loyalty, and blood were weapons more lethal than bullets. And as he stared at the evidence, the whispers, and the undeniable signs of Nathan's presence, one truth became clear: Britt's nightmare had only just begun, and the battle for her soul was no longer a fight against strangers, but against her own brother resurrected in shadows. What made the truth all the more chilling was the precision with which Nathan manipulated Britt's illness. Huntington's disease was already a curse that robbed her of certainty, stripping her body of control and her spirit of peace. But under Nathan's dominion, it became more than an affliction, it became a leash. Every pill she swallowed was not a step toward relief but a reminder that her autonomy was gone. The medication she relied upon to function was rationed and restructured in ways she could not detect, given, or withheld depending on her compliance. The therapies she endured, once meant to sustain her quality of life, became rituals of subjugation. Nathan's methods were not the crude chains and locked doors of Faison or Peter, his were far more refined. He didn't need bars or guards to keep her captive. He made her body itself the prison, her condition the shackle, her need for care the weapon that held her powerless. It was this calculated cruelty that revealed how deeply Nathan had descended into darkness. He wasn't driven by simple vengeance or the thirst for power that had consumed his father and half-brother. His approach was colder, more insidious, almost clinical in its precision. Where Faison had reveled in chaos and Peter had grasped at authority, Nathan had chosen domination of a subtler kind, one that left no visible marks yet crushed the will of his victim. In this, he surpassed them, not through sheer violence but through psychological mastery. Britt was not just a prisoner in his grasp, she was the subject of his twisted experiment in control, caught in the perfect balance of dependency and fear. For Liesel Albrecht, should this truth ever reach her, the devastation would be unbearable. She had mourned her son with a grief that had broken her, replaying the loss again and again, burdened by the guilt of a mother who had failed to shield him from the fate their family's darkness had promised. Now she would be forced to confront a cruel paradox: Nathan had not died, but the son she had loved no longer existed. In his place was a stranger wearing his face, a man who had allowed the family curse to corrode him from within until he became indistinguishable from the monsters he once resisted. The realization that her child had not been taken by death, but by corruption, would cut deeper than any bullet ever had. Instead of solace, Nathan's return would plunge Liesel into a torment from which there could be no release, breaking the fragile fabric of the West Albrecht family beyond repair. Jason found himself standing at the precipice of a dilemma more agonizing than any battlefield he had ever faced. His entire life had been built on the clear lines of loyalty and duty, to protect those who could not protect themselves, to fight those who threatened the people he loved. But here, the enemy was not a faceless adversary. The man holding Britt captive was her brother, the last remnant of family she might have clung to with hope in her weakest hours. To strike against Nathan would mean shattering what remained of Britt's belief in kinship, to extinguish the faint ember of love she still harbored for her brother. Jason knew that in saving her, he might also destroy her, forcing her to accept that her brother's resurrection was not a blessing but a curse worse than his death. Yet hesitation was its own form of betrayal. Each moment Jason faltered, Britt's captivity deepened. The longer Nathan's grip tightened, the more her identity risked being hollowed out until nothing of the woman Jason knew remained. This was not a war where victory lay in defeating a foe. This was a war where delay meant erasure, where the cost of mercy might be Britt's very soul. Jason stood caught between duty and compassion, between the necessity of action and the weight of consequence. He was not just battling the forces of good and evil, but grappling with the cruel demands of truth and loyalty, where every choice was lined with tragedy. The battle had ceased to be one of bullets and fists. It had become a battle of wills, of faith, of love and betrayal. Jason's heart warred with his instincts, torn between the ruthless clarity of a soldier and the fragile hope of a protector. Nathan's shadow loomed over all of it, not as the ghost of a man lost years ago, but as the twisted echo of a brother resurrected into something monstrous. And Britt, her body enslaved by illness, her spirit bound by her own blood, was the one who would pay the highest price, unless Jason could find the strength to confront the horror that family had become. Nathan's return was not simply the shocking revelation of a man long thought dead, it was the unraveling of a nightmare far larger than any one person could contain. What Jason pieced together from fragments, documents buried in false names, whispers of experimentation, and the chillingly deliberate methods of control, suggested that Nathan's survival had not been the act of a man who chose exile, but of one who had been broken down and rebuilt for a purpose more sinister. It raised a question Jason could not shake: was Nathan truly the author of his own darkness, or had he become a vessel shaped by forces hidden in the shadows, a pawn in a much greater game of power? The possibility that Nathan had been subjected to brainwashing or psychological conditioning gave his cruelty a new dimension. This was not the hot-blooded tyranny of Faison, nor the ambitious cruelty of Peter. It was something colder, more methodical, as though Nathan himself had been rewired to serve an agenda. If that were true, then the man who once fought against the darkness of his family's legacy was now its most efficient instrument, turned into a weapon precisely because he had once embodied resistance. And Britt, his sister, was the first and most immediate casualty of this transformation. She was not merely his victim, but the proof that his corruption was complete. For Britt, the discovery that Nathan was her captor would be soul-shattering. The betrayal would slice deeper than chains or bars ever could. Her disease had already stripped her of strength and independence, leaving her dependent on fragile routines and constant medical care. To learn that Nathan had twisted her vulnerability into a prison, controlling her through medication, using her illness as both leash and cage, would be unbearable. She would face the impossible choice of resisting him or protecting him, because her heart could not sever the bond of blood even when it became the very weapon used against her. There would be moments when anger surged in her veins, when she might dream of breaking free, of tearing away the false compassion Nathan cloaked himself in. But those flames of rebellion would quickly be smothered by guilt and a desperate need for family. In her weakest hours, she would cling to excuses, telling herself that Nathan was sick, that he was brainwashed, that he was as much a victim as she was. She might imagine that with enough love, with enough loyalty, she could bring him back from the edge. That impulse to protect him, to shield him even from justice, would be her undoing. For every attempt to save him from consequences would only tighten the snare he had already laid around her. What she believed to be compassion would, in reality, be surrender. Jason, watching from the outside, would find himself in a crucible of impossible choices. His life had always been defined by clarity: protect the innocent, destroy the threat. But here, the lines blurred beyond recognition. Nathan was both threat and victim, both monster and brother. To take him down might save Britt physically, but emotionally it could destroy her, leaving her with nothing but the knowledge that her last link to family had been extinguished by Jason's hand. And yet hesitation was its own crime. Every day Jason delayed, Nathan's hold over Britt deepened, eroding her will until there might be nothing left of the woman he had come to save. The situation grew more dire when tragedy struck Maxie. Whether through death, coma, or life-threatening injury, her fate sent shockwaves through Port Charles. The timing was cruel. if Nathan chose this moment to step out of the shadows, it would look less like a miracle of survival and more like the manifestation of a curse. His return on the heels of Maxie's downfall would feel to many like the embodiment of the West Albrecht legacy, a living omen that no matter how far they tried to run, their past sins would always return to claim them. What should have been a resurrection of hope would instead become a shroud of despair. For Liesel Albrecht, the devastation would be absolute. The son she had mourned, the loss that had defined her grief, would no longer be dead, but he would not be the man she remembered. Instead of solace, Nathan's return would slice open a wound deeper than death. She would be forced to accept that she had not lost her child to violence, but to corruption, that his soul had been consumed by the same darkness she had spent her life alternately serving and regretting. To see Nathan become the jailer of his own sister would be to face the ultimate punishment, a mother watching her legacy destroy both her children. No reconciliation could heal that rift, no explanation could absolve it. The family would shatter into irreparable fragments. And Port Charles itself would not escape unscathed. Nathan's existence posed a threat beyond Britt, beyond Liesel, beyond Maxie. His very survival destabilized the fragile equilibrium the city had fought to maintain through years of bloodshed and betrayal. If a man like Nathan, once held up as proof that goodness could exist even in the darkest of lineages, could fall, then what hope remained for anyone else? His corruption was a message to the entire city. No one was immune to the curse of blood, no one could truly escape the sins of their fathers. The ripple effect would be profound. Families already fractured would fracture further. Trust, already rare, would become nearly impossible. The streets of Port Charles would no longer be a place of healing and redemption, but a battleground where loyalty was questioned at every turn. The return of Nathan would ignite rivalries, draw lines in the sand, and push people into impossible choices between love and justice, truth and denial. Jason, caught in the center of it all, would bear the heaviest burden. His every move would be weighed against the twin weights of compassion and necessity. If he moved against Nathan, he risked Britt's soul. If he hesitated, he risked her life. The war was no longer between light and dark, but between illusion and reality, between the lies families told themselves to survive and the truths that could destroy them. In the end, Nathan's presence was more than the return of a single man. It was the embodiment of a curse, a living echo of every sin and betrayal that had ever haunted Port Charles. His survival meant that the past had not only returned but had evolved, sharpened, and grown more insidious. And as Britt remained trapped in the delicate web of love, loyalty, and domination, the city itself teetered on the brink of collapse, waiting to see whether Jason could break the cycle, or whether he, too, would be swallowed by it. The revelations surrounding Nathan's return fractured not only the lives of those directly entangled in the West Albrecht family but also the very fabric of Port Charles itself. Fans watching from the outside mirrored the turmoil within the story. Some clung desperately to the hope that Jason, as he had done so many times before, would step into the fire and drag Britt back into the light. To them, Jason was the one constant, the unyielding savior whose unwavering sense of duty had pulled countless souls back from the brink. They envisioned him dismantling Nathan's carefully constructed prison, cutting through the invisible chains of psychological manipulation, and restoring Britt to freedom. These fans hoped for redemption, for the possibility that even against the darkest odds, love and loyalty could outlast the scars of family betrayal. Yet just as many others were more cynical. They recognized the depth of Nathan's hold, the precision of his control, and the weight of Britt's conflicted loyalty. To them, Britt was already too far gone, ensnared not only by Nathan's tactics but by her own heart. Her illness, her dependence on medication, and her yearning for family created the perfect storm of vulnerability. They feared she might never truly escape, not because Jason would fail, but because Britt herself would never choose to sever the bond. These observers whispered that perhaps she would even defend Nathan, shield him from justice, and in so doing, damn herself. For them, the tragedy was inevitable. Jason could fight as fiercely as he wanted, but the battle would always be lost if Britt chose captivity over freedom. And so the narrative split into two visions, one of salvation and one of ruin. But beneath both possibilities lay a single unshakable truth: the darkness of the West Obrecht family had returned, and it was wearing the face of a man once loved. Nathan's re-emergence was not a homecoming but a perversion, a resurrection twisted into something monstrous. His familiar face, now distorted by control and corruption, became a symbol of the family's curse, that no matter how far one ran, the sins of the past would always resurface.